Robert Chenoweth had never been a man who apologized for his instincts. 63 years of building hospitals, raising a daughter alone after his wife's death, and navigating institutional power had taught him one truth. He could read people. He could see through charm, past rehearsed smiles, beyond carefully constructed facades. And he saw all of it in Marcus Webb. The boy bee, 'cause that's how Robert thought of him, despite Marcus being 28, had appeared in his daughter's life, like smoke through a cracked window. Quiet, unremarkable. A mechanic who worked with his hands, who spoke in half sentences, who never quite met Robert's eyes during strained dinners. Sarah, brilliant Sarah, with a PhD in her future, had somehow attached herself to this cipher of a man. There were no scandals. No obvious red flags. Marcus didn't drink excessively, didn't raise his voice, didn't flaunt arrogance. But that was precisely what unsettled Robert most: the absence. The void where personality should be. The way Marcus would sit at their table, responding with minimal words, his gaze always drifting toward Sarah, as if seeking permission to exist. He's hiding something, Robert had told his daughter more than once. Men like that always are. Sarah would shake her head, her eyes carrying a weight Robert couldn't identify. You don't know him, Dad. And she was right. He didn't. He didn't want to. It was a Tuesday morning when Robert found himself standing in Sarah's childhood bedroom, 3 weeks after she'd moved out to live with Marcus despite his protests. He'd come to box up her remaining things. The envelope was wedged behind her old desk, trapped between the wood and the wall, yellowed, forgotten. When Robert pulled it free, dust scattered in the morning light. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, careful, almost childlike in its precision. To be opened only if I don't make it. There was no name, no date, just those 8 words, in faded blue ink. Robert stood there, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands, and felt something cold settle in his chest, a premonition he couldn't name. A door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. He had no idea that everything he believed about Marcus Webb, about his daughter's choices, about the last 4 years of his own righteous certainty, was about to shatter. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Tales of Injustice. This is where the stories that don't fit into headlines are told. Marcus Webb was the kind of man who disappeared in crowds. Average height, average build, with brown hair that never quite settled into a style and a face that people forgot within minutes. He wore faded jeans and work shirts, his hands perpetually stained with engine grease. When he spoke, which was rarely, his voice carried the flat, cautious tone of someone who'd learned early that words could be used against you. He'd grown up in the eastern part of the county, where houses leaned slightly and optimism went to die. His father had left before Marcus's 5th birthday. His mother worked double shifts at a packaging plant and came home too exhausted for conversation. School had been something to endure. Marcus graduated with unremarkable grades, the academia equivalent of his general existence. At 19, he'd found work at Friedman's Auto Repair. The owner, Carl Friedman, believed in second chances primarily because first chances had never worked out for him either. Marcus proved competent with engines, patient with difficult repairs, reliable in the way quiet people often are. He showed up on time. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for much. By 28 he'd become Carl's lead mechanic, a title more prestigious than it was. The shop employed 4 people total. Marcus made $32,000 a year and lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat, where the walls hummed with industrial dryers, and the air always smelled faintly of detergent. People in town knew him the way they knew the post office present, functional, unremarkable. The waitress at Murphy's Diner knew he ordered the same breakfast every Saturday. The clerk at the hardware store knew he paid in cash and never made small talk. The librarian knew he checked out repair manuals and occasionally, unexpectedly, poetry collections. He never discussed with anyone. He had no close friends, no social media presence, no obvious ambitions beyond the next repair job. When Sarah Chenoweth walked into Friedman's on a rainy October afternoon with a failing transmission, Marcus had been under a Honda Civic. He'd rolled out, wiping his hands on a rag, and found himself looking at someone who seemed to exist in an entirely different dimension of possibility. She was bright and articulate, dressed in clothes that suggested both purpose and means. He'd fixed her transmission. She'd thanked him. 3 weeks later, her car had developed an electrical issue, so she'd said. Marcus suspected the problem was manufactured, an excuse. But when he had told her it was just a loose battery connection, something he could fix in 2 minutes for free, she'd laughed and asked if he wanted to get coffee anyway. He'd said yes, though he couldn't have explained why. People like Sarah didn't have coffee with people like Marcus. Over week diner coffee, she talked about her research in environmental policy, her dreams of influencing climate legislation. Marcus had mostly listened, offering little about himself. yet she'd kept coming back. For weeks, then months. She'd bring lunch to the shop. She'd show up at his apartment unannounced, never seeming to notice or care about its smallness. When they'd started dating, officially, Marcus had waited for the inevitable recognition, the moment when Sarah would understand the vast distance between their worlds and step gracefully backward. But that moment never came. Instead, she'd introduced him to her father. Robert Chenoweth was everything Marcus was not. Commanding, successful, certain. He'd built Chenoweth Medical Consulting into a multi-million-dollar firm. He owned a house with columns. He wore suits that cost more than Marcus made in a month. He looked at Marcus the way a jeweler might examine a counterfeit stone. Their first dinner had been an exercise in quiet humiliation. Robert had asked questions designed to expose inadequacy, career goals, educational background, family history. Marcus had answered honestly, watching Robert's expression harden with each revelation. No college, no ambitions beyond his current work. A family that barely qualified as such. "Sarah tells me you read quite a bit," Robert had said, his tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "Some," Marcus had replied. "What are you reading now?" "Repair Manual for German Fuel Injection Systems." Robert's smile had been thin, satisfied. He'd found confirmation of limitations, of a mind that couldn't reach beyond the mechanical, the mundane. What Robert hadn't known was that on Marcus's nightstand beside that repair manual sat a collection of Reina Maria Rialca's letters, which Marcus read slowly, repeatedly finding in the poet's words about solitude and longing a mirror of his own interior life. But men like Robert Chenoweth didn't ask follow-up questions. They drew conclusions and moved on. Over the following months, as Marcus's relationship with Sarah deepened, Robert's campaign of subtle dismissal intensified. He never raised his voice, never made explicit accusations. Instead, he wielded silence like a weapon, though he paused just a beat too long before acknowledging Marcus's presence. The way he'd discuss Sarah's future as if Marcus weren't sitting right there. "I've got it," Marcus would say, quietly, when Robert reached for a check. "Don't be ridiculous," Robert would reply, and the word ridiculous would hang in the air like an indictment. "Sarà Sahum? Italiano." She'd argue with her father in private. "He's good to me, Dad. He's kind. Why can't you see that?" "I see exactly what he is," Robert would respond. "The question is why you can't." Marcus never defended himself, never argued his case. He simply endured the way he'd endured everything else in his life, with quiet resignation. He was unremarkable, limited, unworthy of someone like Sarah. The only thing Robert Chenoweth got wrong was thinking Marcus didn't know it. Sarah had always been able to read silence. Growing up with a father who wielded quiet disapproval like a weapon, she'd learned to interpret the spaces between words. So she knew, long before Marcus ever said it, that her father's contempt was crushing something vital in the man she loved. She'd watch Marcus at family dinners, his shoulders gradually curving inward as the evening progressed, his responses growing shorter, his gaze fixed on his plate. Afterward, driving home, he'd be even quieter, staring out the window with an expression that reminded Sarah of war veterans, haunted, exhausted, enduring. "You don't have to keep doing this," she'd told him once. "We don't have to see him." "He's your father," Marcus had replied, as if that settled everything. "And she'd stopped the word catchin'. They'd been dating for 8 months. The word she wanted existed somewhere between boyfriend and future. Marcus had glanced at her then, something flickering in his eyes. Hope maybe, or fear. "I'm what important?" She'd finished, the safer word, the smaller truth. He'd nodded and turned back to the window, and Sarah had felt the familiar frustration rise. This was how it always went with Marcus. She'd reach for depth, and he'd offer surface. She'd ask for vulnerability, and he'd give her facts. It was like loving a locked door. Her father noticed this too. "He doesn't even fight for you," Robert had said during one of their arguments. "A real man would stand up, would prove himself worthy. But he just sits there, taking it." "What does that tell you?" "It tells me he has dignity," Sarah had shot back. "That's not dignity, Sarah. That's passivity. That's weakness." The words had hit harder than Sarah wanted to admit, because somewhere, in a place she didn't like to examine, she'd wondered the same thing. Not about weakness, she'd seen Marcus's quiet strength, but about engagement, about whether someone could truly love you if they never fought to keep you. There were moments when she'd test it, gently. She'd mention a colleague who'd asked her to dinner, watching for jealousy that never quite came. She'd talk about opportunities in other cities, waiting for him to ask her to stay. She'd bring up future planned marriage, Chilarandi. He'd listen with careful attention, but he'd never reach for those dreams himself. "Do you see a future with me?" She'd asked him once, late at night, the question emerging from frustration and wine. Marcus had been quiet for a long time. "I see you in every future I can imagine," he'd finally said. "That's not the same thing." "I know. Then what are we doing here, Marcus?" "We're here because you chose this. You keep choosing it. I've never understood why, but I'm grateful for it every single day." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." And that was the pattern. Sarah pushing towards something solid, something she could name, and Marcus offering only his presence, his quiet devotion, his infuriating refusal to claim her in any definitive way. It was that he didn't love her, she could feel it in the way he looked at her. But it was a love that seemed to expect nothing, demand nothing, ask for nothing in return. Her father saw it as manipulation. He's making you do all the work. He's letting you chase him, so he never has to risk anything himself. But Sarah knew it wasn't calculation. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Sometimes, watching Marcus sleep, she'd see an expression cross his face that suggested dreams she'd never be allowed to hear about. He carried something, some weight that shaped the contours of his silences. She'd asked him about his childhood once. He'd given her basic facts: absent-father, working mother, empty years. But when she'd pressed for details, he'd simply said, "There's nothing there worth talking about," and changed the subject with such finality that she'd never asked again. The truth was, Sarah loved Marcus, in spite of not fully understanding him. He was a mystery she couldn't solve, a puzzle with missing pieces. But as their relationship stretched into its second year, as her father's opposition intensified and Marcus's silence deepened, Sarah began to feel the weight of being the only one fighting for them. "Why won't you fight for this?" she'd asked him one night after a particularly brutal dinner at her father's house. Marcus had been putting dishes in her sink, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am fighting for it. By sitting there and taking his abuse. By not leaving." He'd turned to face her. "By showing up every time, even though I know what's coming. By staying when every instinct tells me to walk away before you figure out he's right about me. He's not right about you, isn't he?" Marcus's smile had been sad, resigned. "I'm a mechanic with no education, no prospects, no family worth mentioning. You're brilliant and accomplished and destined for things I can't even imagine. Your father looks at me and sees someone who's going to hold you back." And Sarah, his voice had cracked. "He's not wrong. Stop it. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true. The only thing I've ever been able to offer you is the fact that I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. And if that's not enough, it is enough. For now," Marcus had said quietly, "but one day, it won't be. One day you'll want someone who fits into your world instead of someone your world has to bend around. And when that day comes, I won't blame you." That conversation had happened 6 months ago, and it had settled between them like sediment, never quite dissolving. Sarah felt it in the way Marcus held her, with a tenderness that felt increasingly like farewell. She heard it in the pauses before he answered questions about the future. And the worst part was that she couldn't entirely argue against his logic. Her father's campaign had been effective. Doubt had taken root. Not doubt about Marcus's character or his love, but doubt about whether love alone could bridge the vast distance between their worlds. Her colleagues at the university had their own opinions, rarely stated but always implied. They'd see her with Marcus at department functions awkward in clothes that didn't quite fit, silent among academics, and she'd catch their carefully neutral expressions. Sarah had learned to deflect, to protect Marcus from scrutiny. But the weight of that protection exhausted her. She was fighting battles on every front against her father's contempt, against her own doubts, against a world that couldn't see in Marcus what she saw, and against Marcus himself, who seemed determined to prove everyone right about his unworthiness. The question that haunted her was whether staying with Marcus was an act of love or an act of stubbornness. She didn't know, and Marcus, true to form, never asked. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March, during what was supposed to be a celebration. Sarah had just received word that her research proposal on corporate environmental accountability had been selected for a prestigious grant, $50,000, and institutional backing that would establish her as a serious voice in her field. Robert had insisted on hosting a dinner, inviting colleagues, university administrators, and hospital board members. Sarah had wanted something smaller, but Robert had been uncharacteristically insistent. Marcus's welcome, of course. The dinner was held at Robert's house, a colonial revival with enough square footage to make Marcus's entire apartment fit in the foyer. Marcus had arrived in the only sport coat he owned, purchased years ago for a funeral, the sleeves just slightly too short. Sarah had stayed close to him for the first hour, introducing him, trying to weave him into conversations, but there was no natural place for him. When the talk turned to policy, he had no expertise. When it shifted to academic politics, he had no context. His silence grew more conspicuous with each passing minute. "What do you do, Marcus?" a hospital administrator had asked. "I'm a mechanic." Oh, the single syllable had carried entire paragraphs. How? Honest? Robert had been watching from across the room, orchestrating interactions, subtly ensuring that Marcus remained on the periphery. When toasts were made to Sarah's achievement, Robert spoke eloquently about her potential, her bright future. He never once mentioned Marcus. The true devastation came later, after most guests had left. Sarah had stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving Marcus in the living room with Robert and 3 remaining guests. Marcus had been standing near the window when he'd heard his own last name. "And relation?" "And relation?" Harrison Webb had asked Robert, gesturing toward Marcus. Robert had barely glanced in Marcus's direction. "I sincerely doubt it." "Webb is common enough." Still, the provost had added, "It's almost funny. Ça me las. Name such different trajectories." "There's nothing funny about it," Robert had said, his voice taking on an edge. "There is nothing funny about watching your daughter attach herself to someone so profoundly beneath her potential." The room had gone quiet. Marcus had remained still, staring out at the dark garden. "Robert," the hospital executive had said, "the young man is right there. I know where he is." Robert had turned to face Marcus directly. "We've been dancing around this for 2 years now. I've been patient. I've been polite. I've waited for Sarah to come to her senses. But clearly, subtlety isn't working." Marcus had finally turned from the window. "Mr. Chenoweth, you don't get to speak yet." Robert's voice hadn't risen, but it had hardened into something crystalline and cutting. "Do you know what I do for a living, Marcus? I analyze systems. I identify inefficiencies. I determine what's helping an organization and what's dragging it down. And you're a drag on my daughter's life, Dad." Sarah had appeared in the doorway, her phone still in her hand, her face stricken. But Robert hadn't stopped. "He has no education, no ambition, no social skills, no future worth mentioning. He contributes nothing to your life except the romantic notion that love conquers all. But it doesn't, Sarah. Love is a starting point, not a destination. And you're rebuilding your life on a foundation that cannot support the weight of who you were meant to become." "That's enough." Sarah's voice had been shaking. "It's not nearly enough. I've watched you dim your light to make him comfortable. I've watched you make excuses for why he can't engage with your world. I've watched you lower yourself. I've never asked her to do any of that," Marcus had said quietly. Robert's smile had been terrible. "No. You've done something worse. You've made her think it was her idea. You've let her carry the entire weight of this relationship while you contribute. Nothing but your wounded silence and your working class authenticity. It's manipulation, Marcus, whether you're smart enough to know it or not." "Robert, stop this." The executive had stood, uncomfortable. "What is not appropriate is a man with no prospects thinking he is good enough for a woman who could have anyone. What is not appropriate is my daughter wasting her youth on someone who will never be able to stand beside her as an equal." Marcus had looked at Sarah then, and something in his expression had broken her heart. It wasn't anger or hurt. It was recognition. Confirmation. "I should go," Marcus had said. "Yes," Robert had replied. "You should. Dad, if he leaves, I leave." Marcus had walked toward the door, pausing only when he reached Sarah. "You should stay. This is your night. You earned this." He'd touched her cheek gently. "I'm proud of you. Marcus, please, I'll call you tomorrow." And then he'd been gone. Sarah had turned on her father with fury. How could I watch my daughter sacrifice her future for a man who couldn't even defend himself? "Sarah, if he loved you truly, he would fight. He would prove himself. He would do something other than accept every criticism as if it's deserved. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I understand that you're confusing pity for love, that you're drawn to his brokenness because you think you can fix it. But you can't save people who won't save themselves, and that man will never be anything more than what he is right now." Sarah had driven to Marcus's apartment, using the key he'd given her months ago. She'd found him sitting on his couch in the dark, still wearing the too small sport coat. "I'm so sorry," she'd said. "Don't be. He's not wrong. Marcus, Sarah, I love you. You know, Edo. But I've always known this was coming. Your father just said what everyone's thinking. I don't care what anyone thinks." He'd looked at her then, tears in his eyes, for the first time. "I care what you think, and eventually, you'll think it too. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year, but eventually you'll look at me and see what he sees. And I can't." His voice had broken. I can't wait around for that. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe your father's right. Maybe the kindest thing I can do is step aside before I hold you back any further. They'd talked through the night, Sarah fighting while Marcus slowly, painfully, retreated. By morning, they'd reached a terrible impasse. I need time, Sarah had finally said. I need to think. Marcus had nodded, understanding everything those words actually meant. 3 weeks later, Sarah accepted a position with an environmental think tank in Washington, D.C. She told her father, first. He'd been quietly pleased. She'd told Marcus less, meeting him at a coffee shop. I'm happy for you, he'd said, and he'd meant it. Come with me. He'd smiled sadly. And do what? Ruin your fresh start before it begins. I love you. I know, and I love you. That's why I'm not going to be the thing that holds you back. Within a month, she'd moved to D.C. They exchanged a few texts, in the beginning careful, polite messages that said nothing real. Then, those stopped too. Robert never mentioned Marcus again. He visited Sarah in Washington, proud of her new position, her new life. And Marcus went back to his life at Friedman's, fixing engines and going home to his empty apartment, carrying on with the quiet endurance that had always defined him. 4 years passed. Neither of them moved on. Not really. They just learned to live with the absence, the way amputees learn to live with phantom pain. The years after Sarah left were not dramatic for Marcus. There was no collapse, no visible breakdown. Instead, there was simply a quiet diminishment, a gradual fading of whatever small light had briefly illuminated his existence. He continued working at Friedman's. He showed up on time, performed his duties with competent silence, and collected his paychecks. Carol noticed something had changed. Marcus had always been quiet, but now his silence had a different quality, heavier and more absolute. But Carl respected boundaries, so he said nothing. He just made sure Marcus ate lunch and occasionally left early on slow days. The studio apartment became both sanctuary and prison. Marcus would come home after 10-hour shifts and sit in the near dark, listening to the rhythm of the dryers below. He didn't read much anymore. The poetry collections that had once offered solace now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Ate porli. Frozen dinners consumed without tasting them. Sometimes he'd forget to eat entirely, noticing only when dizziness forced him to sit down. His weight dropped 20 pounds. His face took on a gaunt quality that made him look older than his 32 years. The worst moments came at random, triggered by a song, a scent that reminded him of Sarah's shampoo, the sight of a woman with similar hair. The grief would hit him with physical force, and he'd have to stop whatever he was doing, standing frozen until the wave passed. There was one night, about 6 months after Sarah left, when Marcus found himself on the floor of his bathroom, sobbing with an intensity that frightened him. He'd noticed her toothbrush was gone. She'd taken it months ago, but somehow he'd maintained a mental image of it still there. The absence had opened something in him. He'd stayed there for over an hour, crying in a way he hadn't since childhood. When it was over, he'd gotten up, washed his face, and gone to bed. He never broke down like that again. He learned to contain it, to look at Hawaii. Work became the only thing that made sense. Engines had logic. Problems had solutions. There was no ambiguity, no judgment. He started taking extra shifts, volunteering for difficult repairs that required patience and precision. He'd stay late, working under fluorescent lights, long after everyone else had gone home. Kyle tried to talk to him once. You're working too much. Marcus, you need a life outside this place. I have a life, do you? Marcus had just looked at him, and something in his expression had made Carl back off. The town's perception of Marcus contracted further. He was the quiet mechanic who kept to himself. People brought him their cars. He fixed them. They paid, they left. Transactions without connection. He preferred it that way now. Connection required hope, and hope had become a luxury he couldn't afford. He saw Sarah once, about 18 months after she'd moved. She'd come back to visit her father for Thanksgiving, and her car had needed an oil change. She'd brought it to Friedman's. Marcus had been in the back when she'd arrived, and Carl had handled the paperwork. By the time Marcus had emerged, she was gone. He'd changed her oil with shaking hands, making sure it was perfect. He'd noticed the Washington, D.C. parking permit. He'd seen the professional briefcase, evidence of the life she was building, the one she was supposed to have. When she'd returned to pick up the car, Marcus had made sure he was under another vehicle, hidden. He'd listened to her voice as she talked with Carl, her tone bright and professional. She hadn't asked about Marcus. After she'd driven away, Marcus had gone to the bathroom and vomited. Robert Chenedwith had gotten exactly what he wanted. Sarah was thriving in Washington, building a career that brought him pride. But there was a cost Robert either didn't see or chose to ignore. Sarah had become brittle. Accomplished, but brittle. She moved through her professional life with impressive efficiency, but something essential had been hollowed out. Her colleagues found her brilliant, but distant. She was functioning at a high level, while operating from an emotional deficit she'd learned to conceal. Robert visited her quarterly, always pleased with her progress. If he noticed that she never seemed truly happy, he attributed it to the demands of her work, not to the absence of someone he'd driven from her life. For Marcus, the deepest humiliation wasn't the dinner party or the breakup. It was the way Robert's assessment had proven correct, at least in the material sense. 4 years had passed, and what had changed in Marcus's life? Nothing. He still worked at the same shop, lived in the same apartment, earned approximately the same salary. He had acquired no new skills, pursued no education, achieved no advancement. He was exactly what Robert had named him: static, limited, going nowhere. The voice in Marcus's head sounded increasingly like Robert's. What do you have to offer, anyone? What makes you think you deserve happiness? You're a mechanic living above a laundromat. Sarah was a temporary delusion. You were always going to end up here, alone, exactly where you belong. He started avoiding mirrors. The person he saw, there thin, tired, defeated, confirmed everything he feared about himself. He cancelled his minimal social media accounts. He stopped answering his phone except for work calls. He became a ghost in his own life. There were nights when he'd lie awake calculating what he'd cost Sarah by existing in her life. 2 years of her time. Energy that could have gone into a career. Social capital spent defending an indefensible choice. It added up like a debt he could never repay. The worst part was knowing that Robert had been merciful. In a way, he'd only said aloud what everyone had been thinking, what Sarah would have eventually realized on her own. Robert had just accelerated the inevitable. Marcus had no framework for understanding that he might have value beyond what he could achieve or acquire. His entire life had taught him that worth was measured in accomplishments, in status, in the ability to contribute something tangible. And by those metrics, he had nothing. Was nothing. The shame of this realization was constant, but quiet. It sat with him during meals, during drives, during the empty hours between work and sleep. It told him that Robert Chenoweth had done him a favor by naming the truth Marcus had always known but had briefly, foolishly, allowed himself to forget. He deserved to be alone. By the 4th year after Sarah's departure, Marcus had achieved a kind of equilibrium. Not happiness, not peace, but a sustainable numbness. He'd learned to not want things, to not hope for things, to not expect anything from life beyond the next repair job and the next paycheck. And he did, every day. Silent, competent, invisible. Robert Chenoweth, had he known, would have viewed this as vindication. The weak man had proven himself weak. The natural order had reasserted itself. But Robert didn't know because Robert never thought about Marcus anymore. The mechanic had been a temporary problem, solved and forgotten. Marcus thought about Robert constantly. Not with anger, with agreement. With the terrible certainty that Robert had seen him clearly when no one else had. And that, more than the loneliness or the grief, was the deepest humiliation. Not being rejected, but being accurately assessed. Not being unloved, but being unworthy of love. Marcus carried this knowledge silently, without complaint, in the privacy of a life that mattered to no one, least of all himself. Robert Chenoweth stood in his daughter's childhood bedroom on a Tuesday morning, in late April, surrounded by the archaeology of a life he'd raised alone. Sarah had called 3 days earlier, explaining that her lease in Washington was ending, and she needed some old furniture. Could he possibly box up the remaining items? Of course, Robert had said. I'll take care of it. The room hadn't changed much in the 4 years since Sarah had left. Robert had kept it essentially as it was, preserving this evidence of her presence. He began methodically, the way he approached all tasks. He'd brought boxers, packing tape, markers. The desk proved challenging. Solid oak, heavy, built to last. Robert had bought it for Sarah's 13th birthday, the year after her mother died. When he tried to move the desk away from the wall, it wouldn't budge. Something was catching. He crouched down, his knees protesting he was 67 now. He peered into the narrow gap between the desk and the wall. There was something there, wedged in the space. Paper? Robert had to partially disassemble the desk before he could access it. It was an envelope. Old, yellowed, its edges soft with age. The moment Robert pulled it free, dust motes scattered in the morning light. The envelope was sealed. Robert stood there, the envelope in his hands, and felt something shift in his chest, a premonition, an unease he couldn't name. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. Careful, deliberate, almost childlike in its precision. There was no address, no name, just 8 words in faded blue ink. To be opened only if I don't make it. Robert's hands trembled. The envelope was light, containing perhaps a single sheet of paper. He turned it over, looking for additional information, a date, a signature, anything. There was nothing. His first instinct was to open it immediately. But something stopped him. The space between the desk and wall wasn't a place someone would deliberately put something important. This had been an accident. The envelope slipping from somewhere and becoming trapped, forgotten. But when had it been written? And by whom? Robert walked to the window, holding the envelope up to the light, trying to see through the paper. He could make out the shadow of writing inside, but nothing legible. He sat on Sarah's old bed, the envelope resting on his knee. To be opened only if I don't make it. The phrase suggested emergency, crisis. Someone had written this as a failsafe, a message to be discovered only in the event of their death or disappearance. But who? And why would such a letter end up in Sarah's bedroom? Robert's mind moved through possibilities with systematic logic. Sarah had been a private person, but not secretive. She'd had friends, but none who would have entrusted her with this kind of letter. Her relationships had been brief, superficial, no one serious enough to warrant such dramatic correspondence. Unless there was something he didn't know. The thought disturbed Robert more than he wanted to admit. He'd believed he knew his daughter completely. What could she have hidden from him? He looked at the envelope again, noting its age. The paper was yellowed, but not brittle. The ink had faded but remained legible. This was an ancient, perhaps 5-10 years old at most, which meant it had been written during Sarah's adult life, probably during her 20s, during the time she was with Marcus. The thought arrived with uncomfortable clarity. Robert tried to dismiss it. Why would Marcus have written such a letter? But once the idea took root, he couldn't dislodge it. The careful handwriting could belong to someone who worked with their hands. The envelope's position suggested it had been in her room, perhaps in a drawer that Sarah had opened carelessly. Robert stood abruptly, pacing. He didn't want to open this envelope. Something in his gut warned him that whatever it contained would complicate his carefully organized understanding of the past. He should throw it away, or send it to Sarah unopened. Let her decide. That would be the appropriate thing. But Robert didn't move toward the trash can. Instead, he sat back down, turning the envelope over in his hands. To be opened only if I don't make it. What hadn't the writer made it through? What crises had loomed large enough to warrant such a letter? Robert's mind kept circling back to Marcus Webb. The timing fit, but what would have prompted Marcus to write such a thing? The man had been frustratingly ordinary. No drama, no crisis, no apparent danger in his small life. Unless there was something Robert didn't know. He looked at his watch, whose past 10. He had a conference call at 1, a dinner meeting at 7. He should finish packing, get on with his life. Instead, Robert went downstairs to make coffee. In the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, he found himself replaying memories he'd long since filed away. Marcus at family dinners, silent and uncomfortable. Marcus receiving Robert's criticism without defense. Marcus walking away from that final confrontation without a fight. At the time, Robert had interpreted all of this as weakness. But what if he'd misread the silence? No. This was absurd. He was letting a mysterious envelope undermine 4 years of certainty. Marcus had been exactly what he'd appeared to be, a limited man with no prospects. Robert had done the right thing by forcing the issue, hadn't he? Robert poured his coffee and returned upstairs. The envelope sat exactly where he'd left it, innocuous and terrible. He picked it up again, weighing it. A single sheet of paper, maybe 2, a few hundred words at most. How much damage could it possibly do? He slid his finger under the flap, then stopped. This wasn't his letter to open. It was Sarah's. Opening it would be a violation of boundaries Robert had always respected, but Sarah didn't know this letter existed. If he sent it to her now, it would disrupt her life, drag her back into a past she'd worked hard to move beyond. Wasn't the kinder thing to spare her that? Robert sat with this rationalization for several minutes, knowing it for what it was, fear disguised as consideration. He wasn't trying to protect Sarah. He was trying to protect himself from whatever truth this envelope contained. To be opened only if I don't make it. The word seemed to pulse with urgency. Someone had written this, believing they might die. Someone had needed Sarah to know something in the event of their death. And that someone, Robert was now almost certain, was Marcus Webb. With hands that shook more than he cared to admit, Robert Cheneyeth broke the seal and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was lined, notebook paper, folded into precise thirds. Robert unfolded it carefully. The same careful handwriting covered both sides, letters formed with such deliberate precision that Robert could almost see the writer's hand moving slowly across the paper, There was no greeting. It began immediately. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it, and I need you to know what happened that night. Not because it changes anything about what I decided, but because you deserve to understand why I made the choices I made, even if you hate me for them afterward. Robert's chest tightened. The tone was wrong, not hypothetical danger, but documenting an event that had already occurred. It was October 4th, 3 years ago. You won't remember the date, but I will never forget it. You texted me that you were driving back from your conference in Hartford, that you'd be home late. I was finishing up at the shop, just after 9 p.m., when Carl asked me to deliver a repaired truck to a customer who lived out on Route 47 en route, 47 en Robert Nuet, a winding two-lane road through dense woods. Dangerous. At night. I was heading back to town when I saw the car. It was off the road, down an embankment, wrapped around a tree. The front end was completely smashed in, steam rising from the engine. At first I thought maybe it was old, but then I saw the headlights were still on, and I could see movement inside. Robert's hands had gone cold. He looked at the date on his phone, did the mental calculation. October 4th, 3 years ago. That would have been when Sarah was 27, still living here. He tried to remember that night, but the days blurred together. I pulled over and climbed down the embankment. The driver's side was crushed against the tree, but I could see through the passenger window. Sarah was unconscious, bleeding from her head, pinned in place by the steering wheel. The windshield was shattered. The car was making this terrible ticking sound, and I could smell gasoline. Robert's vision blurred. His hands shook so badly he had to set the letter down, pressing his palms flat against the desk to steady himself. Sarah had never mentioned an accident, never mentioned being injured, being in danger, being saved. How was that possible? He forced himself to pick up the letter again. I tried the passenger door, but it was jammed. I called 911, first thing, but the dispatcher said it would take at least 20 minutes for emergency services to reach us. Route 47 is far from everything, and it was raining hard. 20 minutes felt like forever when I could see blood running down Sarah's face, when the smell of gasoline kept getting stronger. I made a decision. I found a rock and broke the passenger window, climbed inside. Sarah was breathing but unconscious. The steering wheel had her trapped, and there was something wrong with her left arm. It was bent at an angle that wasn't natural. I knew I wasn't supposed to move someone with injuries like that. Every first aid course says to wait for professionals, but the gas smell was overwhelming, and I kept thinking about fire. Robert felt bile rise in his throat. He remembered suddenly, and with horrible clarity, Sarah coming home one night, around that time with her left arm in a cast. She'd said she'd fallen, slipped on wet steps outside the university library. He'd scolded her for not being more careful, had barely looked up from his laptop. A minor fracture, she'd said. Nothing serious. He'd believed her. He'd never questioned it. I managed to shift the steering wheel enough to pull her free. It took everything I had. I got her out through the passenger side just as the car made this sound. This metallic groan, like the whole thing was about to collapse further. I carried her up the embankment. She's small, but the incline was steep and muddy from the rain. And my shoulder, the sentence ended abruptly. Picked up again, 2 lines down in shakier handwriting. My shoulder gave out halfway up. We both fell. I landed wrong. Felt something tear, but I got us up again. By the time I reached the road, I could barely use my left arm. I laid Sarah down on the pavement, as gentle as I could, and that's when I saw how much blood there was. From her head, from cuts on her arms. I took off my jacket, used it to try to stop the bleeding from her temple. The jacket was new. I'd bought it for our 6-month anniversary dinner the week before. It was the nicest thing I owned. Robert's eyes were burning. He didn't realize he was crying until a tear fell onto the paper. He wiped his face roughly, angry at himself. At Tisleter, the ambulance arrived 13 minutes later. 13 minutes. That felt like hours. Sarah woke up briefly while I was holding the jacket against her head. She looked at me and said, "Marco," like she couldn't believe I was there. Then she passed out again. The paramedics took over. They asked me what happened, and I told them. One of them looked at my shoulder and said I needed to come to the hospital too. I said I would. I followed in my truck. At the hospital, they took Sarah to emergency surgery. Something about internal bleeding. A skull fracture. I sat in the waiting room with this useless arm, and all I could think was that I should have been faster, should have been better at saving her. Robert had to stop reading. He stood up, walked to the window, tried to breathe normally. His daughter had been in emergency surgery for a skull fracture and internal bleeding, and he hadn't known. Where had he been that night? He returned to the letter. You showed up around midnight. I don't know who called you. You came in like a hurricane, demanding information, demanding to see her. The doctors wouldn't let you in yet. She was still in surgery. You sat down in the waiting room, and that's when you saw me. You looked at me at my muddy clothes, my ruined jacket, my shoulder that I was holding at a weird angle. You asked what happened. I told you. I told you about finding the car, pulling Sarah out, the ambulance. You listened without expression. Then you asked me one question. Did you see what caused the accident? I told you I didn't know. You nodded, then stood up and went to talk to the doctors. You didn't say thank you. You didn't ask about my shoulder. You didn't acknowledge what I'd done except to extract information. Robert's face burned with shame. He could picture the scene exactly, could see himself in crisis mode, focused solely on Sarah, on understanding the situation. Marcus would have been just another source of information. A nurse finally made me get my shoulder looked at, torn rotator cuff. They said I'd need surgery, months of physical therapy. They gave me a sling and pain medication and told me to schedule a follow-up. I went back to the waiting room. You were on your phone, making calls, handling things. Sarah came out of surgery around 3 a.m. Stable, but critical. Skull fracture, broken arm, internal bleeding they'd managed to stop, severe concussion. The doctor said if she'd stayed in that car much longer, if the internal bleeding hadn't been caught when it was, she probably wouldn't have made it. You took this information calmly, asking technical questions. I stayed until they let you see her. You went in alone. I waited outside her room, and when you came out 30 minutes later, you walked right past me. I called your name. You stopped, turned, and looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not gratitude, not relief, something else. You said, you should go home. Get some rest. We'll handle things from here. We? Not Sarah. We. Like you were already creating a story that didn't include me. Robert closed his eyes. He could hear his own voice saying those words. At the time, he would have thought he was being kind, practical, but reading it now, through Marcus's eyes, he heard what the young man must have heard. Exclusion. Erasure. I went home. My shoulder was screaming. I sat in my apartment and waited for you to call, or for Sarah to call when she woke up, but no one called. I texted Sarah the next day. No response. I called. Voicemail. I drove to the hospital, but the nurse said she was only accepting immediate family. On the third day, you said Sarah was recovering well. You thanked me, formally, for my assistance. Then you said something I've thought about every day since. Sarah's been through a trauma. The doctor thinks it's best if we minimize stress during her recovery. She's having some memory issues from the concussion. It might be better if you gave her some space right now. Let her heal. I asked if I could just see her for 5 minutes. You said no. You said it gently, but it was still no. You said you'd tell her I'd been asking about her. You said, when she was ready, she'd reach out. Then you hung up. Robert's hands trembled violently. He didn't remember this conversation, but he believed it had happened. It sounded exactly like something he would do, protecting Sarah, controlling the situation. She never reached out. I waited 2 weeks, then went to the hospital again. They said she'd been discharged. I went to your house. You answered the door. You invited me in, sat me down, and told me Sarah had asked you to speak with me. You said the accident had shaken her, made her reevaluate her life. You said she needed time to focus on her recovery and her work. You said she thought it would be better if we took a break. I asked if I could hear that from her. You said she wasn't ready to see me yet. The concussion had affected her memory. She didn't remember the accident clearly, didn't remember me being there. The doctors said forcing memories could cause more trauma. You asked me to respect her recovery process. You asked me to step back. I asked when I could see her again. You said you didn't know. Maybe in a few months, when she was stronger. You walked me to the door. You shook my hand. You said, "Thank you for saving my daughter's life. I won't forget what you did." Then you closed the door. The letter ended there. Robert turned the page over, desperate for more. But the reverse side was blank, except for a few words at the very bottom. I'm having the shoulder surgery next week. There are complications, something about my heart. A murmur they found during The surgeon says it's probably fine, but he's required to tell me there are risks. So I'm writing this just in case. Because if I don't make it, Sarah should know the truth. Not to make her feel guilty. Not to change anything, just because she deserves to know. I love her. I saved her. And her father made me disappear. Marcus wept. Robert stood frozen in Sarah's childhood bedroom, the letter hanging from his hands, his entire world reorganizing itself around this new, devastating truth. Robert sat down heavily on Sarah's bed, the letter clutched in his hands, and for the first time in decades, he had no idea what to do. His mind, usually so quick to organize information into action items, simply spun in place. Marcus had saved Sarah's life, had risked his own body, had torn his rotator cuff carrying her up an embankment in the rain, had sat beside her, bleeding in the dark. And Robert Hedgie couldn't finish the thought. It was too monstrous. But the evidence was there. Robert had taken the moment of Marcus's greatest act of love and courage and had used it to separate him from Sarah, had manipulated the situation, had used Sarah's concussion-induced memory loss as a tool, had convinced Marcus to step back for Sarah's sake, when the truth was, Robert forced himself to think back to that time, to October 3 years ago. He remembered the terror of getting the call, the drive to the hospital with his heart hammering. He remembered Sarah in the hospital bed, her head bandaged, her arm in a cast. He remembered the doctor telling him how lucky she'd been, how if someone hadn't pulled her from the vehicle when they did, the internal bleeding might have killed her. Someone, not Marcus. The doctor had said someone, and Robert had asked, who, and the doctor had checked the notes and said a young man named Marcus Webb. The name had landed in Robert's consciousness with immediate recognition and immediate dread. Robert remembered asking Sarah about it the next day. She'd looked at him with confused eyes and said she didn't remember much. She remembered driving, remembered the rain, remembered something about headlights, then nothing until waking up in the hospital. Marcus was there, Robert had told her. He pulled you out of the car. Sarah's expression had been blank, struggling. I can't remember. And Robert, God help him, had seen an opportunity. He'd told himself he was protecting her, that she was vulnerable, traumatized, that the stress of navigating a relationship while recovering was too much, that Marcus's presence would complicate her healing. These were the stories he'd told himself, and he'd believed them because he'd wanted to believe them. But underneath had been relief. Relief that the accident had created a clean break. Relief that Sarah's memory loss gave him the authority to manage the situation without her interference. So he'd called Marcus, had thanked him with careful formality, had instructed Marcus to stay away, framing it as a medical necessity, as being in Sarah's best interest. Marcus had believed him. Of course he had. Why wouldn't he? Robert was a father, concerned about his daughter's health. Marcus was just a mechanic who'd happened to be in the right place. Except he wasn't just a mechanic. He was the man who'd loved Sarah enough to risk his life for her, who'd destroyed his own shoulder, pulling her from a wreck, who'd sat in a hospital waiting room in pain for hours just to make sure she survived. And Robert had erased him. The full weight of it hit Robert like a physical blow. He bent forward, the letter still in his hands, and made a sound that was half sob, half retch. He'd done this. He'd taken the most profound act of love and sacrifice, and had weaponized it to achieve what he'd wanted all along, and it had worked. Sarah had recovered with no memory of Marcus's rescue. By the time she was well enough to see Marcus again, weeks had passed. The distance had created doubt. Sarah hadn't understood why Marcus had stayed away, had interpreted his absence as indifference. Marcus, following Robert's instructions, had been waiting for permission that never came. The relationship had limped along for another year, but something fundamental had been broken. And when Robert had finally destroyed their relationship at that dinner party, Marcus hadn't defended himself, because he'd already accepted that he deserved Sarah's loss. Robert had convinced him of it months earlier. The cruelty was breathtaking. Robert saw it, now with horrible clarity. He'd taken Marcus's greatest act of love, and had turned it into a weapon. And he'd done it so smoothly that Marcus had cooperated in his own erasure. Robert stood on shaken legs, and walked downstairs to his study. He sat at his desk, the same desk where he'd built his company, made his fortune, controlled so much of his world. He thought about Sarah in Washington, still believing the story Robert had constructed. She didn't know Marcus had saved her. Didn't know her father had deliberately separated them. Didn't know that the distance she'd interpreted as Marcus's weakness had actually been Marcus's respect for what he believed were her wishes. Robert picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. His hand was shaking. He could destroy this letter. Sarah need never know. She'd moved on, built a good life. Why disrupt that with information that would only cause pain? But even as Robert tried to construct this rationalization, he knew it was obscene. This wasn't about protecting anyone. It was about protecting himself from the consequences of what he'd done. The phone rang in his hand. Sarah's name on the screen. Dad, did you get my boxers packed? Robert opened his mouth. Nothing came out, Dad. You there, Sarah? His voice sounded strange, broken. I need to tell you something. Are you okay? You sound weird. I found something in your room. A letter. Silence. Then, what kind of letter? From Marcus, written 3 years ago. About the accident. Another silence. What accident? And there it was, the proof of his manipulation. Sarah didn't even remember, clearly, the one on Route 47. October 4th. 3 years ago, I remember being in an accident. I broke my arm. But I don't what does Marcos have to do with it? Robert closed his eyes. Everything. He has everything to do with it. Sarah, I need you to come home. I need to give you this letter, and I need to tell you what I did. What you did. Dad, you're scaring me. I'm scaring myself. Robert's voice cracked. I did something unforgivable, and you need to know about it. Sarah came home 2 days later. Robert met her at the door, and she was shocked by his appearance. He'd aged years in 48 hours. His face was haggard, his eyes red. He gave her the letter without preamble, watched her read it in his living room, watched her face change as the truth reorganized her understanding. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen before, not just anger, but disappointment. Betrayal. Tell me this isn't true, she whispered. I can't. It's all true. You told him to stay away? You used my concussion, too, her voice broke. Dad, how could you? And Robert told her. Everything. The phone call to Marcus. The manufactured story about needing space. The deliberate withholding of information. The weeks of keeping them apart. All of it. Sarah listened, with tears streaming down her face. He saved my life. I know. He taught his rotator cuff, pulling me from the car. I know. And you made him disappear. Her voice was rising now. You took the man who saved my life, and you erased him. And then at dinner, you called him worthless. You destroyed our relationship. And all along, she couldn't finish. She was sobbing now. Robert wanted to reach for her, but he had no right. I thought I was protecting you. From what? From someone who loved me enough to risk his life. From someone who had more integrity in his silence than you've had in all your manipulation. The words hit like they were supposed to. Where is he? Sara demandet? Where's Marcus? I assume still at Friedman's Auto Repair. Sarah stewed abruptly. I have to see him. Sarah, don't say anything else. I can't look at you right now. She left, taking the letter with her, and Robert sat alone in his living room surrounded by the evidence of his success, their expensive furniture, the awards on the walls, the life he'd built through control and certainty. All of it felt like ash. Sarah drove to Friedman's Auto Repair with the letter in her passenger seat, her vision blurred by tears. The shop looked exactly as she remembered: squat, industrial, honest in its ugliness. Through the bay doors, she could see figures moving in the dim interior. She parked but didn't get out immediately. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, and she tried to organize the chaos in her mind. What do you say to someone who saved your life? Who loved you enough to step aside when told it was what you wanted? Who endured your father's contempt and never once defended himself by revealing the truth? The letter sat beside her. I love her. I saved her. And her father made me disappear. Sarah got out of the car. The bay was cool and smelled of oil and metal. A young mechanic looked up. Help you? Help you? I'm looking for Marcus Webb. The mechanic's expression shifted. He's in back. Who's asking? Sarah. Sarah Chenoweth. Something changed in the young man's face. Hold on. He disappeared. Sarah waited, her heart hammering, suddenly terrified that Marcus wouldn't want to see her, that too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway. 4 years had changed him in ways that broke Sarah's heart. He was thinner, his face more angular, harder. There were lines around his eyes. His left shoulder sat slightly lower than his right, the permanent evidence of torn tissue. He wore the same type of work shirt, but he carried himself differently now, more carefully. They stared at each other across the bay. Marcus's expression was unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't move toward her. Sarah. Just her name, spoken quietly, and Sarah started crying again. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't remember. He never told me. Marcus. I didn't know. Marcus's face changed. Understanding, arriving. He found the letter. It was stuck behind my desk, all this time. And she couldn't continue. She crossed the distance between them. She wanted to touch him, but was afraid. You saved my life. I did what anyone would have done. No. Sarah's voice was fierce. No, you did what you did. You destroyed your shoulder. You sat with me. You, she held up the letter. You wrote this in case you died in surgery, and you never told me any of it. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus looked at the letter, then away. Your father said it would hurt your recovery, that forcing memories could damage you further. I believed him. He lied. I know that now. Marcus, that dinner. The things he said to you. You let him destroy us. You let me believe you didn't fight for us when you'd already given up your shoulder, your health. You'd already fought harder than anyone ever has for me. I thought it was what you wanted. The distance, the break. Your father said. I know what he said. He told me everything. Sarah's voice broke, and I hate him for it. But Marcus, you could have told me the truth at any point. What would that have accomplished? Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. Making you feel guilty. Making you choose between your father and me. Sarah, you'd just survived something that nearly killed you. I wasn't going to make your recovery about my feelings. So you just suffered in silence. I'm good at that. The self-deprecation was so familiar it hurt. Sarah wanted to shake him. Left you. I moved to DC, and I let us end. And the whole time you knew you'd save me and I didn't even remember. You needed to build your life. You're doing incredible work in Washington. Your father showed me articles about you. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Sarah stared at him. My father showed you articles about me. Marcus's expression shifted, became uncomfortable. He came here, about a year ago. Brought his car in for service. He didn't know I'd still be here, but Despised let me work on his car. While I worked, he talked, told me about your career, your achievements. I think he wanted me to know you were okay, that his choice had worked out. His choice. Sarah's anger rekindled. It wasn't his choice to make. Maybe not. But Sarah, look at your life. Look at what you've accomplished. Would you have done that if you'd stayed here? Yes. The answer was immediate. Yes. Because you never held me back. You supported everything I did. The only person who made me feel limited was my father. Not you. Marcus looked down at his hands. I'm still a mechanic, Sarah. Still living above a laundromat. It's still exactly what your father said. I was You're the man who saved my life. Sarah's voice was steady now. You're the man who loved me enough to let me go when you thought it was what I needed. You're the man who carried me up an embankment in the rain with a torn shoulder and never asked for recognition. That's who you are. Sarah, I'm not asking to pick up where we left off. I'm not asking for anything except she stopped, uncertain. Except maybe for you to let me say thank you. For my life. For loving me the way you did. For being better than everyone who judged you, including me. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked up at her. You didn't judge me. You saw me. For 2 years, you saw me when no one else did. I forgot you. The words were anguished. The one moment when you were most yourself, and I forgot it. You had a brain injury. That's not forgetting. That's trauma. I should have known anyway. You did. Marcus's voice softened. Sarah, you came back. After the accident, after your father told me to stay away, you came back. You cried me you wanted to see me. You felt something, even if you couldn't remember why, that mattered. Sarah realized he was right. She'd been the one to reconnect, had sought Marcus out despite having no memory of his rescue. Some part of her had known. What happened to your shoulder? She asked. Surgery went fine. Recovery was hard. Took about a year to get full function back. It's not perfect, it aches when it rains. I can't lift as much as I used to, but I manage. And your heart, the letter mentioned a murmur. Nothing, false alarm. So you wrote that letter for nothing? No. Marcus looked at the paper in her hands. I wrote it in case I didn't get to tell you the truth. Turns out I got 20 more years or so to think about whether I should have. 20 years of silence. 20 years of knowing you were okay. That was enough. But it wasn't enough, Sarah thought. It wasn't nearly enough. I'm going to stay in town for a while, Sarah said. I have some things to figure out with my father, about what kind of relationship we can have after this. Marcus nodded, but didn't ask the question she could see in his eyes. And us. Can I see you again? She asked. Really see you? Not to process the past, but to find out who we are now. If there's still something here. There's still something here. Marcus said it quietly, with certainty. There's always been something here. The question is whether that's enough to build on, after everything that's happened. I don't know, Sarah admitted, but I'd like to find out. Marcus smiled then. The first real smile she'd seen. Small, sad, but genuine. Okay. Okay. He glanced at his hands, wiped them on a rag. I should finish this break job. But maybe dinner. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Sarah agreed. Not Murphy's, somewhere new. Somewhere that's hours from now. Not from before. She left feeling like she was walking out of one life and into another. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in 4 years, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than absence. Robert was waiting when she returned. He stood as she entered, his face haggard with hope and fear. "Did you see him?" "I saw him." And Sarah looked at her father, this man, who'd raised her alone, who'd built empires, who'd controlled so much through sheer will, who'd loved her enough to destroy what she loved because he couldn't imagine her happiness looking different from his plans. "You need help, Dad. Real help. From a therapist who can help you understand what you did and why." "I know what I did, no. You know the facts. You don't understand the depth of it." Robert's face crumpled. "I can barely live with myself now." "Good," Sarah said, and meant it. "That's a start. Because Marcus lived with what you did for 4 years. He carried the weight of believing he wasn't good enough. And he never complained. Never defended himself. Do you understand what kind of person does that? A better person than me." "Yes." Sarah's voice was hard. "A better person than you. And you almost destroyed him because you couldn't see past your own fear and control." Robert sat down heavily. "What can I do? Help? Actually examine why you needed to control my life so completely. Figure out whether you can be in my life without trying to run it." Sarah paused. "And Marcus, you owe him more than an apology. You owe him amends, real ones." "I'll do anything." "Then start by meaning it when you say you're sorry." "Not sorry, you got caught. Sorry for what you did." Over the following weeks, Robert did something he'd never done before. He gave up control. He started therapy. He wrote Marcus a letter, not an excuse, but an acknowledgement of harm done and a commitment to make amends. He offered to pay for medical expenses Marcus had incurred. Marcus declined most of it, accepting only Robert's word that he would never interfere in Sarah's choices again. Sarah and Marcus began carefully, meeting for dinners and long walks, relearning each other. The love was still there, it had never left. But trust needed rebuilding. Sarah needed to prove she saw him now. Really saw him. Marcus needed to learn that he could claim space in Sarah's life, could believe he deserved happiness. It was slow work. Sometimes painful, but it was real. A year later, Sarah moved back from Washington. Not for Marcus, she was clear about that for herself. She'd accepted a position at a state-level environmental agency, work that mattered and that didn't require her to live in a city she'd chosen partly as escape. She and Marcus married quietly 2 years after that, in a small ceremony that Robert attended with the humility of someone who learned he'd almost destroyed the most important things through his certainty of being right. Marcus never became what Robert had thought Sarah should have. He remained a mechanic, eventually buying Friedman's when Carl retired. But he became something Robert had never imagined. A partner who supported Sarah's ambitions without needing to compete with them, who loved her without needing to control her, whose quiet strength proved more durable than any of Robert's loud certainties. And the letter, the one that had been hidden for years behind a desk, stayed in Sarah's possession. A reminder that love isn't always loud, that dignity sometimes looks like silence, and that the most profound acts of courage often go unwitnessed until years later, when the truth finally surfaces and reorders everything you thought you knew. Robert lived long enough to see his first grandchild, a daughter with Sarah's eyes and Marcus's careful quietness. He held her in his arms and wept, understanding finally what he'd almost prevented from existing. "I'm sorry," he told Marcus one afternoon, the baby asleep between them. "I'm sorry for all of it." Marcus looked at the child, at Sarah laughing in the next room, at the life that had been built from the ruins of Robert's interference. "I know," he said quietly, "and I forgive you." It wasn't immediate forgiveness. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was enough, because, in the end, the truth had done what truth does when it finally emerges. It had transformed judgment into understanding, contempt into respect, and silence into a story worth telling, a story about a man who saved a life without asking for recognition, who loved without demanding reciprocation, who endured injustice with dignity until the hidden letter surfaced and revealed what had always been true. He had been worthy all along. The world just hadn't known it yet. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people who were judged too quickly, forgotten too easily, then subscribe to Tales of Injustice, because there are many stories like this, and most of them are never told.